Hi friends, and welcome back. Firstly, thank you to everybody that has subscribed, and also those who've given me feedback already on the first episode. It felt a little rusty going into it, so I'm glad that some of you have enjoyed and been encouraged by it from all different walks of life and parts of the world. So thank you so much. Always encouraging. As I did with the last series, I just continue to do this while this is primarily beneficial to me. I know it's selfish, but I don't believe in doing generative things like this or externalizing things when it becomes contrite or it becomes forced. So I'll keep doing this for as long as it's natural, that it's helpful for me, that it's a season for it. And in the meanwhile, hope that the stack of you benefit from it as well. So your feedback's always important. I do appreciate that. Everybody who's written in and been encouraged. We are still talking about, this is going to be part 2 on exploring what ecological systems theory, Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory, how that connects to situations, or how we might look at faith deconstruction, or even church-based wounding, and those things are often connected for a lot of people. How we might look through this theoretical lens at a situation like that. Why do this? Well, again, we want to be able to expand our thinking, look into new areas, change the color of the glasses we're looking at things so we can see new things, change the magnification, change the perspective. And quite often, and we know this even therapeutically, often we go to therapists, counselors, psychologists, etc., and one of the things they allow us to do is to just see things a bit differently. And as soon as we do, things begin to open up for us. Keys and answers to next steps open up for us. And so, we're taking this childhood development theory called Ecological Systems Theory, or EST, that was created some 70 years ago. And we're considering how we might begin to look at this faith deconstruction, church wounding scenario with this in mind. And I never want to make you promise, but I really think if you allow yourself to think about the things we're talking about, and that I explain and explore a little more in detail this episode, you might begin to see things a bit differently. And I'm going to try and throw some personal stories and things like that in here too. Before we dive into the nitty-gritty of it, though, I know it's been a few years since I've been on here. I've written posts and blogs over the years, which have, I've been open and honest with my journey and relationship with the church. And there's a brilliant little talk that Brene Brown did many years ago on her relationship with the church. She said, if the church and I were going to go to couples therapy, this is how I'd approach it. These are the things I would say about her or him. This is, if we were a couple, this is what I would say about the church, which I think is a great, kind of analogy to use. Understanding primarily that our relationship with a collective group is just that. It's a relationship with a collective group, and it's deeply emotional. It's deeply psychological. It's in most cases, not all, unless because you might be drawing a salary or something like that, so it begins to leak into your financial world. But largely, this is a relational, interpersonal, and psychological connection that you have with the church. And for those reasons, it's a deeply spiritual connection that you have. But your connection, you might agree, You're there because of a collective belief and connection to God. And yet here's this relationship that you have that has become complex, it's become strained, it has now involved wounding, it has, the church, as you've seen it and as you've had relationship with it, has perhaps wounded you through betrayal or disappointment or some kind of traumatic event. And friends, the people I've sat with over the years, I'm no longer surprised at how people who happen to be in the church, either individually or collectively, it might be the board of a church or something, can be absolute dicks. They can be really mean, really unsympathetic, really deceived, really stupid, really, I'm not here to throw sort of moral judgment, even though I'm kind of doing that with these labels, but just crazy stuff. And I'm not even talking about things where sexual abuse and those kinds of things are involved. I'm just talking about the way that some people are treated. This is what happens in systems. And we're going to talk about identity theory and groupthink another time, but here is this very complex thing that you have. So it's important to understand that as we look into ecological systems theory too, we're talking about layers and layers and layers of relationship and connection that you have to the world and to this local and larger entity called the church. Yeah. The good news is, and speaking from sort of my experience, getting back to me, I think, and I've found that as you give it some time and you understand that this is and can be a very long-term relationship that you have, that there are actually a lot of options out there that, let's say you might compare it to a strained, difficult, and now divorced relationship, marriage, for example. You now have this opportunity to begin to date and to see and to explore a whole new type of person, a whole new set of relationships, a whole new way of doing life. Because not only are you often divorced and separated from that person, but you're divorced and separated from obligations and the complex system and web that they are part of, right? And you can begin to explore something else. And I think it can be quite similar when we talk about deconstruction of our faith or sort of a constraint or strains around our relationship with particular churches or denominations. So I had been come to faith in and spent, I think, around 12, 15 years in more of a Pentecostal environment, and then moved to more of a Baptist environment, then moved to more of an interchurch environment. And through my own ministry and travel and some of the non-for-profits that we set up allowed us to go cross-denominational. But it still had, by and large, because of the work I was in inner healing and those kind of approaches, I still had this aspect to my faith that had deep spiritual and mystical connections. And right now, where I am is different again. Ken Wilber and others use this, I think, really healthy and wonderful terminology of as we grow, as we mature, we're called and invited, even by God, to transcend and include our old selves, older versions of ourselves. Because anytime there is stress and strain, fissures and factions around our relationship with any entity, including, let's say, the church, there is this, often part of the healing is forgiving ourselves for, say, believing or being involved as we were, right? We have to begin to come to terms with the fact that we might have been fooled or fooled ourselves. And so there's a process, of course, of realizing, man, what was I thinking? And we can beat old versions of ourselves up, not wanting to repeat that, and that can be normal. But I'd like to encourage you and invite you to think about ways that you can include that old version of you, transcend that, right? It has to be included. So the decisions I made, which I might look back at my younger self now at 46, looking at things I did at 21, 22, even 32, even in my mid-30s, etc. I'm thinking, what the hell was I thinking, Dave? What were you thinking? Like, that was dumb, it was irrational, it was stupid. But at the time, it was important to me. At the time, I felt God was calling me to this. At the time, these things were meaningful and they worked. And I said yes to some of these things because of who I was right then. So we have to understand, and this is actually the outer layer of the ecological systems theory, is the chronosystems, the chronological systems, that over time we are not just human beings who stay static throughout our lifetimes, but we're human becomings. We're always becoming something next, and the whole system changes from day to day, month to month, year to year around us. And so we adapt and we make decisions at the time that might seem right and good at the time. And to be able to move on means we have to also be able to forgive ourselves, to be able to reconcile decisions that we've made, even if they've caused pain to ourselves and others around us, and to be able to say, okay, that's included. That's actually part of my story. At the time, I made the decisions I made, and here I am today. If we don't do that, what we end up with is fractured parts of ourselves. We end up with chapters in our lives that are, stapled or glued together, and the story no longer makes sense. From a perspective of faith and redemption, and what often is an overarching story within the Christian scriptures, the Abrahamic scriptures, in fact, is a story of redemption, right? My friend Paul Young calls God the redeeming genius. You think you're playing checkers and God's actually in the background somehow playing three-dimensional chess, and things just turn out differently. And I think one of the keys to see that, I'm not going to say happen quicker because it's not about speed, but perhaps happen gentler and friendlier, is by starting to realize and include and transcend older versions of you. Yeah? And so older versions of me have done things, said things regarding the church that I could in some ways regret or repent of, or maybe try and bring back and say, please ignore that poem, please ignore that post. But that wouldn't be fair to who I was at the time, because some people might need to hear what I was saying at the time, because they are where I was then. And that's important. And the voice and the language that I give through poetry or prose or story or encouragement at the time is really important to them. So keep that in mind as we talk here. For me, my relationship has just evolved right? Because I'm in process. And I've began to let go of trying to nail and embed into a season or a particular phase in my relationship. Just with life in general, to be honest. And that does include my faith and religion as well. My eldest son loves church, is deeply involved, reminds me a lot of where I was at his age. He's playing drums, he's in music, he's in a great church, and I see a lot of things in him that I experienced and loved with the youth and church and the youth group and people in it. And, it's just wonderful. If he was going to go down the exact path I was headed, there are some things I'd say. But he's not, because I never had a seasoned Christian and or minister as a dad. His home life and his ecological system is very different to mine. So I don't need to fear, because it's very different time, it's a different story, it's a different situation. And so I encourage him, get into it. We support him in all these things he wants to do. And if he has questions, he knows he can come to us, right? Because we have lived experience and wisdom. He can hear the difference in the way that we explain things and go over things. It sounds very different from his 46-year-old seasoned father than it might from a 21-year-old youth pastor, right? And he's smart. He knows that. We know that. That's a very long preamble, but that's the way this goes. I wanted to think, again, just tell you very quickly, as a reminder, if you haven't listened to the first part of this episode 2, or is it episode 1, whatever, the last one, what ecological systems theory is. If you ever want to draw this or look up EST, you end up with something that looks like an onion, right? It's just a circle in the middle with another circle around it. We call that a nested layer. But you could just think of it as an onion. And right in the middle is the individual, okay? Out from there is something called a microsystem. Out from there is a mesosystem. Out from there is an exosystem. Out from there is a macrosystem, super macrosystem. Basically, it's layers and layers. And that's what the system suggests and posits, is that all our lives are made up of constantly moving different complex layers that influence our lives. Yeah. So right at the center is you. Yeah. At the core center of this, and I'm going to speak, this is really about the immediate environment around you. And I'm just going to sort of start, I'll read a few things out here from my phone as I'm walking safely, looking ahead, not crossing any roads. But around you immediately is your microsystem, right? This might be your family's religious practices and reactions to questions. And that might be inclusive or exclusive, right? Just your family might not have religious practice, but there's still a practice of thoughts, yeah, of sorts. You have to think about your local church, community, relationships there. Your close friends are part of this immediate circle. A small group of Bible study relationships that you have. And then your personal prayer, your devotions, those kind of things. In this circle too might even be your spiritual gifts, your doubts, the religious experiences you have, your personal faith journey, right? The story of your conversion experience, all are part of this inner circle. Yeah, the microsystem, the immediate individual experience that you have, yeah, tangible, very close to you. If we go out to that, we look at something, the next layer out, the mesosystem. This is the interaction. This explains interactions between your personal microsystem around you and then everyone else's microsystem around them. So for me, the closest and most influential microsystem around me is my wife's, right? So if I think about her family practices, her reactions to questions at home, her local church setting, even before we met, and then including, as we're in the same circles, close friends, hers, mine, and ours, the small groups that we might attend if we go to different ones or whatever. So this next layer out is everybody's microsystem all sort of linked together, right? And it's the interaction between everybody's microsystems. We call that the mesosystem. And this is where tension happens, because your microsystem's very different to somebody else's, right? Your system is unique to you. Get this, understand this, honor this, think about this. Your system is very different. So this is tension between church friends, maybe even non-religious friends. This is where families' religious views, might affect workplace settings. It's complex. This is where theological learnings, childhood teachings, there can be conflict in this mesosystem as well. This sort of thing can impact on dating relationships, on marriage if there's a partner, right? Has different views because your microsystems are different. So this is the stuff that happens in the mesosystem. And it can also even be just a very core and easy thing to understand that you might have come from a very different background. Your microsystem's very different, and you walk into a faith community, and the questions that you have and the way that you talk, you might address God or other issues is vastly different. And so this can create tension within these next sort of systems, right? The mesosystems. So we have they're all our individual microsystems. That's really about us. They're the first couple of layers, right? And when we talk about you, let me just back up for a minute here. When we're talking about you also have to take into effect, right in the core of this whole circle, your age, your gender, your cultural background, your family's religious history, the things we mentioned before, your gifts, your doubts, things that happen in your head, things that are written into your history, right? So then the microsystem are all the things around you, all the immediate environment, church, blah, blah, blah. The mesosystem is a conflict of those first two layers. Yep. So what might it mean to be a middle-aged Black American female in a predominantly white British conservative church in the outskirts of London? There's sure to be some tension there. Yeah. Or what might it mean to be a fairly new convert to Christianity from Islam? You're from Iran, and you've entered a church community in rural Queensland. What is that like? So these are the conflicts. This is what happens in the mesosystem. Out from there, the next layer out is the exosystem, right? And this is where you have institutional structures, and these things actually affect our individual faith. They move down into the circle. These are denominational policies, yeah, seminary, education systems, how the pastor's trained, right? There's education systems that are endorsed and promoted within that exosystem, right? This larger structure, institutional structure. There's religious legal frameworks, there's tax policies that affect churches, there's local zoning, there's ministerial certificate requirements, there's a whole lot of different things that happen there. You might even talk about the way the church does its social media, right? What's perhaps, particularly if we're talking about people that have strained or traumatized relationships with the church, does that church allow for that? Does it normalize that? Is there counseling available? Are you supported and invited to access this kind of things, right? That's the sort of thing that happens at that exosystem level. So I'll pick an example out of that. It was interesting coming from, say, a Pentecostal background where there is not, or was not, I'm going to say was not, I don't know what it's like predominantly now, I haven't heard largely different, but the way pastors are trained are more about how to run a ministry. Okay, in Australia we call this TAFE, or vocational kind of training, right? It's an educational approach which says, you know, if you're going to want to be a senior minister or work in this field, you know, you might make your way up the ladder like this: kids church, youth church, associate pastor, senior pastor. There's the career ladder, and you just slowly have to get really good at some core skills. Yeah, here's how you mobilize people to volunteer. Here's how you disciple people in a particular way. So it's very vocational and skills-based. Within a lot of these ministry schools, there's some theological training. When I moved to, and I never went through that myself, I was close to a lot of people that did that, and also was involved in managing a training organization that was delivering this kind of training. I'm not making judgments about whether these are good or bad. They both have their pros and cons. I think vocational training in any sector is very good and helpful, right? When it came to moving across to the Baptist church here in Australia, I found they were so much more theologically turned on. They were so switched on, I should say. Some of them might have been turned on, but they were switched on a lot more. They knew their Bible, they knew their scripture, they were okay with nuance. It was a very different proposition, yeah. But all these things spilled out into the congregation, right? So in the last thing we talked about spiritual markers of spirituality. I found in the Baptist church, one of the bigger markers, even congregationally, was like how well you knew your Bible, how well you knew the scriptures. If you talk to somebody in a small group, it was more theological, it was more cerebral. In the Pentecostal environment, it was a lot more practical in that, or, you know, it was where you worked for God. It's how you volunteered, how you got involved in ministry. There was always this big sort of push within that system too, to be called to ministry, that it was a great and wonderful thing to be called to ministry, and you should want to do that, and let's get all our young people and sit them up the front. That was not the case at the Baptist church. Right, they were struggling to get young people into ministry. Part of the culture was not there. Part of the culture was not there to promote and to encourage young people to a call in ministry. Right? Prophetic ministers didn't come in and point at three people in the front row and say, God's calling you to ministry, God's calling you to this, God. You know, that was commonplace for me in that kind of environment. And so young people aspired to get into, be involved in ministry because it had accolades, it had a sense of calling, and it was aspired to. Not so much in the Baptist church. I remember sitting at a state conference and one of the speakers saying, we are really bad at this. The Pentecostals, or in our particular case, the ACC church, was so much better than this. You know, why are their conferences, why are they full of younger people? And we're lucky to try and get somebody over 40 to feel a sense of call. I'm not making any judgments about that, just telling you what my experience was. But again, that's an exosystem thing that affects us. Yeah, that has affected you. That plays a bigger part in your faith journey than you might actually realize. So, moving out from that indirect environment exosystem, we move into something called the macro system. Yep. And the macro system is the cultural context. Okay, so as a refresher, we've had the personal environment, you, right, as the individual. We've had the immediate environment, microsystem. We had the mesosystem, which is the interaction between the immediate environments. We have the exosystem, which is the indirect environment. Okay, and as this goes out, you have less and less control and less say, but you are affected by it. And so now we're talking about the macro system, which is the cultural context. And this is the overall cultural experience of being a Christian. Now, we're exposed to enough media, and I know enough friends in America and spoken to enough American friends to understand that the Australian Christian experience, the American Christian experience, is quite different. It's just we don't have the giant Christian colleges the same. We don't have the popular Christian culture the same. There's a lot that is very different, even cross-denominational. I have a good Mormon friend here in Australia that comes from the States, and he's shared with me what it's like growing up in that community, what it's like growing up in Utah, yeah, right, in that big cultural context. So this includes that cultural experience. It includes your broader societal values, including broader societal values of people who walk away from their faith or struggle with their faith or begin to change and re-examine their faith, perhaps in deconstruction. You have to understand that too. There are cultural shifts that happen in particular religious sects and participations as well, and expressions, yeah? For example, I know that the Lutheran churches in Australia have just very recently, in the last few months, voted on, and there's been a majority vote, I think it might have been 2/3, I'm not sure, don't quote me on that, but it was a majority vote, and this has been through a number of times, majority vote for yes, that women should be ordained to senior ministry positions. You can go and look that up if you want. But the Lutheran churches is a 500-year-old institution. It's one of the first sort of breakaways from the Catholic Church, and in Australia, women have never been able to be in senior ministry roles, and now they can. So think about how that, as a macro system, as decisions that are made at a board and national level, how that affects women in that church, and think about that over time. So the 60-year-old woman that's been desperate to be ordained and recognized for her gifts and service and ability to do so many things, that woman might be not only happy but also grieved that it took so bloody long, right? But there are young girls in primary school today who 20 years from now are going to be living a very different experience, say in the Lutheran Church, because we'll begin to see photos of synods and pastoral gatherings that involve women. There will be, in the next few years, clippings and media releases about the Lutheran Church in Australia's first ordination of a woman. And I don't doubt that we'll also begin to see, as always happens in these cases, a schism, a break in the church. And I believe this happened in the American church, who've had women in ministry for a long time in the Lutheran sort of church and expression in America. And they're quite different. There are more conservative and more liberal branches. Favorite author and speaker of mine, Nadia Bolz-Weber. She's covered in tats. She's, confessing, recovering alcoholic. She talks about sex and gender, and communion and the Eucharist and loving one another and serving your community. She's even featured on The Simpsons before. But we're only coming to that in Australia. I'm using that just as a real simple current example. That here's an exosystem, here's a macro system, which is cultural context that affects your faith, affects your journey, whether you know it or not. Because I came from a Pentecostal background, right? Women were in ministry in Pentecostal churches for a long time. I never even thought it was an issue till I moved outside of it. And others said, no, we don't allow women to preach, to be ordained in senior roles. I was like, oh, why not? And they had answers, but so did the Pentecostals, right? Some took more of a Genesis view, and others took views from, I don't know, it's the book of Colossians, one of Paul's views. You go do religious gender studies and work it out yourself. Also, academic and intellectual perspectives on religion affect that. Being involved in the Lutheran Church a bit more today, particularly through my job and role in chaplaincy, the Lutheran churches release like academic journals, like I think every 6 months or quarterly. Really, I mean, these people are academics. These people are super clever. My boss has a doctorate, in theology and divinity. That's part of that system, and that affects people's faith, how they interact with that, all kinds of things. Yeah. All right, if you're still with me, the last, well, let me just check something here. We've got I just talked about a macro system. There is also in some charts a super macro system. And this might go beyond denominations into collective religious and social forces. Yeah. So there could be global Christian movements. There could be international religious freedom issues. So, for example, there are some great and wonderful institutions and charities that are built that raise money, funds, and awareness for religious persecution of Christians in other countries, where Christians are killed, hanged, persecuted, really suffer for their faith. And there are global movements of support across denominational boundaries that do that. We might call that a super macro system involvement here. Then, of course, let's expand beyond Christian. There's also religious conflict. Yep. Muslims and Christians, Muslims and Jews, Jews and Christians in some cases. Yeah. And over history, there'd be a clash between, I suspect, violent clashes between every major religion. Yeah. And if you look at the history of East Timor, you'll see even the Buddhists are involved in this, right? Groups have their extremities. Groups have these conflicts of macro systems. And in the super macro system, we see a lot of that happen. Okay. The last layer, as I kind of intimated on before, is this chronos system. And this is environmental and societal changes over time that affect religious practices and beliefs, right? These are secularism trends. I guarantee you, to use the example before, the push and the wanting for women to be ordained in Christian ministry in Australia has been affected by women's rights movements, the rise of feminism, equal rights movements. All these things have affected, and it is normal and good and very common for chrono systems and super macro systems which to affect smaller parts of this, right? Smaller parts of systems. So on this sort of outer layer, this chrono system, we look and consider all the inner layers and what they look like at particular points in time. So there are societal changes over time, right? Phyllis Tickle has a great book called, I think it was called The Great Emergence. Phyllis Tickle as in, give somebody a tickle. Phyllis with a Y. Great book. Talks about the 500-year cycles of change in the church. And hey, look, we are 500 years from the Lutheran Reformation. And hey, there's a major change. And hey, she even said, one of the next schisms and breakups will probably be around sexuality and gender. There you are. Every 500 years, the church is a garage sale and it begins to question who the authority is. Yep. And that is often prompted by larger macro systems and super macro systems and happens over time. So again, even what I started with is this story of including and transcending old versions of yourself. Understand that the systems around you at that time, at any point in time, were very different than the way they are today, because, and this is a reason I love process and relational philosophy and theology, is that we understand that everything is in process, everything is an event, everything is unfolding. Even at a quantum level, everything is moving and in process and is becoming and is growing and is breaking down. So no time is the same. No moment is the same. I think it was Humanities said no man steps in the same river twice, meaning that you don't if you put your foot in a river, a moving river, and you pull it out and then you put it back in, the body of water is different, right? The cells around you, the whole stream has changed in some way. So Chronosystems honors this, right? Think about Christianity in your country. Think about, in Australia, we have things around people wanting to remove tax benefits from churches. We have some large institutions, churches, Hillsong, for example, that have been under the spotlight. We have the Catholic Church that's been under scrutiny for child sexual abuse. They've been under a whole lot of things. Now, does that mean that every Hillsong church and every Pentecostal church, every Catholic church is breaking the law? No, of course not. We need to own and honor that, right? And those that are being dishonest, justice has to be served in those areas, and that's often done again at a super macro system about what's right or wrong at the time in larger society. But again, in this chronosystem, we have the changing views of Christianity. We have historical events affecting faith communities, e.g., how COVID changed the face of the earth. If you think you're powerful, just compare yourself to a germ, compare yourself to a virus, and see how you go as a person. The evolution of worship styles begins to shift around. Great example, just off the top of my head here, is when Pentecostalism came in, this whole idea of participative worship where everybody got to sing and everybody got to worship and everybody got to participate in the singing, changed the face of the church in the West, largely because a lot of denominations, it was a sit down, shut up, or be part of, the ministers and those approved had to do it. And a lot of churches were forced to change the way that members were able to or could participate in worship in as far as music went, for example. Or taking of the Mass Eucharist communion as well. Shifts in biblical interpretation of change, generational changes, and religious participation. All that happens on a chronological, in that chronosystems level. And so for you might think about your personal faith milestones and experience. You might think about major life events that have prompted your questioning, your deconstruction, the stress and strain on your relationship with the church, right? How has this happened over time? Right? What are the historical events in your life? Right? How has your theology evolved? How has your understanding evolved? Understanding that it can evolve and change. It would almost in some cases be abnormal for it not to. Now, you might have some quote unquote core beliefs and core values, but you've made those up, or you've been encouraged to make those up. Or you've been encouraged to have those because it helps you fit in. Yeah. And now you're at a point where you can begin to re-examine this. Again, I encourage you, transcend, include, love, honor, listen to, love, and come alongside the older parts of you that are struggling right now with the new version of you that's emerging. So that's ecological systems theory at a broader and, I guess, more descriptive sense. These are all different layers. And I'd love for you to think about it. Some people have even started to draw charts, right? They draw their own ecological system theory and consider everything within that. Maybe you're that kind of person who loves pen and papers, you love diagrams. Maybe you even just want to start a chart. You start the first part of it and you just write a page of what is it about me individually, and begin to think about your age, your gender, your culture background, your family religious beliefs, your personal beliefs. Move out to the microsystem. Talk about that immediate church experience you've been through. Move out to the mesosystems, right? Talk about the interactions between different church-related settings. Go out to the exosystem. Think about the institutional structures that affect individuals' faith and collective faith down in other circles. Go even broader, go to the macro system. Talk about the cultural context of Christianity. Again, go out and think about perhaps the super macro system, or even for you, just the chrono system. Yep, the milestones, the events, the evolution of your faith, things that have happened over time. And what this will do is allow you to see nuance, allow you to honor your story as yours alone. And what I love about it is, if you get really good at this, and you begin to see the world through this lens, I think you can be more compassionate, more loving and empathetic towards others too. And this includes, and I'm going to quote Jesus here, of loving your enemies, of beginning the journey of loving, maybe forgiving, maybe having an amends, or it might just be, what they call in recovery a living amends, that it's just something you begin to journey on. It doesn't mean you have to approach these people or persons, but you begin to reconcile and consider and love and be firstly compassionate towards yourself, your own journey, the decisions you've made, all the things we've talked about. But extending beyond that, we begin to consider how you might extend that to others, understanding that all these people are as unique in their systems and involvements and things that have influenced them, and vice versa as you have. And we move from critical judgment to considered assessment. And I think that is worth heading towards. I do. I've had a lot of people hurt me over the years. I've had a lot of disappointment and a strenuous relationship with the church, which for me, having been in ministry for so long, has involved this combination of a system where my personal faith, passion, and journey has intersected with my income, right? Which has immediately affected the sort of the microsystems and the exosystems of my whole family life, of my kids, right? My kids lived in poverty, went through financial hardship because of the decisions that I had made based on my faith, my sense of calling, and that's affected them. And so I've had a lot to untangle and a lot to do, and I still do. I'm still journeying. I'm not, by no means have arrived. And if I honor the chrono system, I understand that it's a process, yeah? That I don't arrive, really. That there's a constant becoming. There's always an invitation to mature, to love, to let go, and to move away from critical judgment to loving assessment, to compassionate assessment, and even a critical assessment of myself. Just to take this thing, write it down on paper, and consider that this is a very complex system that we all live in. And there are things that I said and decisions I made and decisions that were made for me that I had no power in. I had no power in the family that I was brought up in. I had no power over the first language I spoke. I had no power about the country I was born in or the time. There's a lot outside our control that have deeply affected us. And that's how it will always be. What we get to own, what we get to be responsible for, and the invitation for us is to make decisions, is to assess things and be compassionate to ourselves and our journey and understanding of how complex the system we live in and that we are, and how equally complex it is for other people around us as well. All right, well, that's a lengthy episode compared to the last. It's a meaty, there's a lot there. Please let me know if this has been helpful. And I hope that for those listening outside some of this context, maybe this has given you some insights around ecological systems theory, Yuri Bronkenbrenner's theory on this. We're going to, again, continue to look through at life and even faith and other things through other theoretical lenses to expand the way that we think. And again, for me, the goal is to live more compassionately, more gently, more considerate of ourselves and others, and begin to see how beautifully, wonderfully complex we are. And I think the scriptures are true, that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. Yeah. All right, my friends, take care. Have a beautiful day.